last video, we looked at fetching some data off of Johns Hopkins Whiting School of Engineering GitHub repository. And in this video, we're going to be following along the same vein and plotting this data in our own application. We're going to be using React. So if you're not familiar with React, then this is probably not going to be the video for you. And I'd suggest looking up some other JavaScript tutorial videos with, say, the D3 library, which is a very popular JavaScript charting library. But if you are fairly familiar with React, let's say with functional components and some basic hooks, then I think you should feel right at home here and be able to follow along nicely. We're going to be looking at Recharts, which is a pretty popular React charting library. It's very comparable to D3 with the exception of some components and some child props here. But there's not a lot of tutorials out there for Recharts, so I wanted to give Recharts some exposure on YouTube. But before we get started, I wanted to give a high-level sort of engineering scope of what we're trying to do and maybe tackle some of the engineering problems that we're facing. All right, when we're thinking about building out features for our application, we want to be considering the constraints given to us and how to optimize our efficiency of these features, especially when you're calling APIs and doing a lot of work on the client side. So if you remember our previous example, what we were really doing is downloading an entire CSV file that corresponded to a single day. So a single day had all these data points. But what if we wanted to plot the data shift or the change between days over a period of months? What we'd really be doing is downloading an entire array of CSV files or appending our data set with every single one of these CSV files. And you'll notice that there's not a lot that's changing between any given CSV file. There's a lot of repeated downloads and repeated calculations that we're having to do because not a lot changes. There's only a couple of strings, only a couple bytes worth of changes here between any given day. And so you'd be downloading this, say for example, header every single day. And you don't need to do that. This reminds me of that recursive problem with the Fibonacci sequence. If you're not using memoization there, your efficiency automatically jumps up to like 2n, which it can be done a lot faster. So in this case, I just wanted to give a high level here. So if you're building out something, consider what can be done on the server side that can reduce a load on the client. And if this was a traditional API, maybe we could request certain things, the exact things we want, with say a header or a GraphQL sort of query. But because this isn't a traditional API, this is really just a GET request to a HTTPS, then we really have to work with what we're given. Luckily for us, the Johns Hopkins Whiting School has put it together a much better data source for our use case. So this time series data, there's a deprecation warning here showing that some of these will be deprecated in the near future. But this global CSV, a couple things with this is you'll notice that on every commit, they're still committing every single day, but on every commit, they're just adding a single row or a single column corresponding to a new day, the current day. And another thing is that this URL is not modular. So it's a single URL and they're making commits to this file, which means we don't have to adjust it for any given date. So that's what we're going to use. We're going to use this to populate our field. All right, so let's get started. Okay, we have our React app open in code, and let's just clean up the boilerplate a little bit. So we don't need these. And we don't need this. And then let's clean up index. Let's get rid of the service worker. And then let's clean up app.js. And for now, we'll just have a div. div. Okay. And we don't have a logo. That'll work. So now we need to install our dependencies. We're using Recharts. The installation's on the guide here. npm install Recharts. And this is just going to be a basic tutorial on Recharts. So I'm not going to worry too much about the React format, and you can choose to render this however you'd like. What I'm going to do is just render a graph component inside of app component and maintain state in the graph component. So we're going to be fetching data from our GitHub repository and holding that as state inside of our graph component. And because of that, we want to use effect and hold a loading screen while this runs when the component mounts. So we'll need use state and use effect. Okay, so since we want this to fetch when the component mounts, we're going to be doing all of our fetch inside of use effect. That takes a function. We'll call this run call, which will be asynchronous inside of our use effect. Our value that we're retrieving we'll call API value, and that will be the awaited value from a function we define as fetch data. And this is all going to be very similar to the tutorial from last time. Our API URL is our new URL that we're using. Now we'll invoke our function run call below and pass in as a second param to our useEffect method an empty array, which lets useEffect know to only run once upon the initial mount of this component. So let's take a look at our API value. We take a look at the console here. And we do get this string body back. Now we want to manipulate this string and get it into the form that Recharts can digest. So if we look at the documentation for Recharts, and this is on their example page for a simple line chart, you'll see that the data needs to be an array of objects where each element of the array, each object, is one single data point. So for this simple example, we're just going to plot some confirmed cases over time for a particular country, but you have access to all this data now, and you can feel free to plot whatever you'd like over any given plot. And I'd recommend watching minutephysics' new video on COVID, where he explains how the layman or the non-statistician can analyze this data and make some sense of it. So that is going to be linked in the description. But for now, let's try and get our data string into the data that we want, where the name would be sort of the date, and then we'll have a key corresponding to the confirmed value for that day. Okay, so we'll need a header to keep track of all our days. So let's delete that. And we'll say it's the API value. We'll split it by line since it's a CSV string, essentially. We'll slice it or make a copy of it. Then we're going to use map, which is a higher order function. Takes a argument, and we'll say the line split by comma, and we want the 0th element, right? And let's just console log that out, and you'll see what I mean. So we'll console log header, and we get this first kind of row in our text body array that we got back as API value. And here's all our headers. So we have the province, state, country, and then we have all the dates. So what we want is this date string, and this is going to be our identifier for our objects. So we actually don't even need these first 4 entries here. So let's slice this again. And now we just get the dates. Okay, that looks good. And we can do something very similar to get the data that we want. So in this case, we want our US data. So if we go back and find US in this row, we'll see that US comes up as line 227, which is index 226. So essentially the same thing. Call this USA data. API value. We'll split it by line break. Make a copy. We'll map for every line. We'll implicitly return the line split by commas. That's no good. And then we want the 226th element or index. So let's take a look at that real quick. And we do get the USA data here. And again, we only want the actual data, or the confirmed cases in this case, starting from the 4th element. Now we can construct our object array that will be the input into Recharts. Let's make some more room here. Right now this will be an empty array. Call it chart data. And we'll just loop through. You can also use map, but you might see why I'm choosing not to use map in this case. So I is equal to 0, and this will be a shared index between header and US data because they are of the same length. That needs to be an object. And we'll say new row at my header value of I is equal to my USA data, or the parse int value, since this is a string here, passing in USA data of the ith index. And we can simply push new row to chart data. Let's see what that looks like. There we go. Now let's handle our state changes within this asynchronous function. So we'll set data equal to our chart data, and we'll set loading to false. And we can just return null or nothing at all, doesn't matter. All right. Now in app.js, let's do h1. This is chart. That works. Now we need to import some things from Recharts. And if you look at the documentation for a simple line, we can just copy and paste this whole import statement. All right. So I realized I made a mistake with my object. So let's go to that real quick. In my loop, I actually don't want this. I want this to be new row dot name will equal my header of I, and new row dot data is the parse int. That looks a little bit different. Let's console log that out. Okay, different but subtly different, and that's going to play a big factor in our format. Okay, so let's restart from scratch here. We'll say div, give it a class name of chart wrapper, and we'll switch back to JavaScript. So is loading, then we'll render simple div, else we'll return this right here. You can just copy and paste this, and we'll talk about it in a second. Okay, so what's going on? We have a component coming from Recharts called line chart with some props that we can change. Let's do this. Data, margins look good. Cartesian grid. Okay, so within the brackets of line chart component, we have some child props. Cartesian grid, x-axis, y-axis. Tooltip is a highlighting for a mouse over event. Legend, line, we don't need 2 lines, just 1. And our data key will be data, I believe. Let's see what that does. All right. So now we have a very simple chart in your React application. So I'm going to clean this application up a little bit, and I'll see you back in a second. All right, so I've cleaned up the code a little bit, and I've added a few things. We have 2 lines instead of 1, so we can compare 2 data sets with each other. We have a selector where we can change the data representation on the graph. I've removed state from the graph component and up into app.js, and I've added a second line here. App now handles all the state changes, and I've removed the function definition of the API calls outside of useEffect, although I'm still calling that function in useEffect. So as it stands now, every time I change the selector, I recall the API function. And in the future, I most definitely want to cache that data initially on the first mount, and the selector just manipulates that data representation on the graph. But that's about it for this video, guys. I wanted to give a high-level overview of Recharts and what you could do with it concerning the COVID data. Everything will be linked in the description, so the Whiting School repository, this code will be in the description, as well as documentation for Recharts and React Select, which is this selector. All right, till next time, bye.